Most people in cold country think winter beats a house because the air is cold. That belief feels obvious, and it keeps families stuck in the same loop. Build a light frame, add some insulation, then burn more wood when it fails. But cold air doesn't steal heat by itself. Movement does. Wind and pressure differences pull warmth out of every seam, then replace it with unstable air that your stove must chase all night. That's why two houses on the same road can face the same temperature and perform like different worlds. So here's today's question. What if the worst-looking home is the one that wins? Imagine driving past a place that seems wrong on purpose, a low-arched steel roof sitting on a heavy stone basement, half tucked into the earth. No steep gables, no proud timber facade, just a shape that looks more like a bunker than a home. People don't just doubt it, they laugh at it. They call it reckless. They say the basement will turn to ice, and the metal will sweat until everything rots. And if you've ever been inside a dripping metal shed in winter, that criticism sounds reasonable. But the criticism is aimed at materials, not the system. A material can behave like a villain or an ally, depending on how it's used. Stone can drain heat or store it. Metal can condense water or stay bone dry. Winter doesn't care about opinions, it cares about physics. In this story, one builder stops trying to fight winter and starts trying to limit what winter can touch. He designs for stability instead of brute force. He wants a home that stays warm even when the fire is not constantly roaring. That decision offends local pride because in many places, hardship is treated like proof of character. If you're not waking up at 2 a.m. to feed the stove, some people think you're cheating. But winter is not a moral test. It's an engineering test. And the moment a real cold snap arrives, wind, snow load, deep negatives, every theory becomes measurable. Thermometers don't care who built the house. Wood piles don't care who was right at the diner. The only thing that matters is whether the structure leaks heat faster than it can be replaced. Stay to the end, because the twist isn't that the strange house feels cozy. The twist is that it stays stable. And stability is the hidden weapon that changes everything. Before we touch numbers, picture the winter routine in that valley. Frost on windows, kids doing homework in coats, and a parent counting split logs like they're counting days. One missed reload, and the house drops 10 degrees before dawn. Pipes complain. Smoke backs up when draft weakens. Everyone calls it just how winter is. But the builder we're following refuses that answer. He keeps a notebook, not for poetry, but for fuel. How many armloads per day? How many hours between reloads? How fast rooms fall after the flames die? He watches the basement too, how it stays colder than the living room, how it pulls warmth downward like a tax. Then he looks at the steel arch and asks, what if the ugly solution is the honest one? The basement is where most winter homes lose the war. People pour thin concrete, set shallow footings, and leave the walls in direct contact with frozen ground. Then they wonder why the floor feels like ice and why the warm air above seems to vanish downward. In that setup, the basement isn't a living space. It's a heat pump running backward. The design we're rewriting starts by refusing the shallow approach. It goes down into stable earth, the depth where daily weather swings stop mattering. In many cold regions, the soil a few meters down holds a narrow temperature band through the year. It's not warm, but compared to sub-zero air, it's a baseline advantage you didn't pay for. Then comes the second decision. Mass. Not decorative stone. Real weight. Thick walls that can absorb energy without spiking in temperature. This is where most critics misunderstand the physics. Stone feels cold when it is draining heat, and when your hand is warmer than the wall. But stone becomes a radiator when it is insulated from the outside and charged from the inside. Charging matters. A standard metal stove is like a match, hot fast, then gone. It dumps a large portion of its heat up the chimney, and the room rides a roller coaster. The builder instead uses a high-mass heater, fire brick channels, long flue paths, a slow release by design. You burn hard for a short time, then the heater gives that energy back for many hours as gentle, radiant warmth. The basement becomes a battery. The heater warms the masonry warms the air, and the thick stone walls soak up the surplus. Because the earth around the basement stays relatively stable, the walls aren't bleeding heat into frozen ground the way shallow foundations do. The system stops behaving like an icebox and starts behaving like storage. One detail makes the difference between clever and habitable: moisture control. A deep earth space can become damp if it's sealed like a jar. So the build includes deliberate airflow, slow exchange, not drafts, so humidity doesn't accumulate. The goal is to keep surfaces above the dew point and to move moist air out before it condenses. And here is the unpopular truth: the basement is not being heated to tropical comfort. It's being charged to a steady, moderate range, warm enough to radiate upward, not so hot that fuel is wasted. That modest target is what allows the battery effect. You don't need peaks, you need stability. Once the basement is stable, the rest of the house stops panicking. The floor above is no longer a cold sink. The living space above no longer depends on constant reloading. The system begins to feel almost unfair, like someone found a loophole in winter. If you want a mental picture, think of 2 cups. One thin metal cup filled with hot water, and one heavy stone mug. The metal cup feels hot, then cools quickly. The stone mug warms slowly, then stays warm long after you stop adding heat. The builder is choosing the stone mug on purpose. This is also why the "stone is always cold" argument collapses. Stone is cold only when it's connected to cold. Break that connection, and stone becomes your slow friend. If the basement is the battery, the steel arch is the lid that stops winter from stealing the charge. The valley's builders hated that idea because they had seen metal buildings fail: icy ribs, dripping ceilings, puddles on the floor, rust, rot, misery. Their conclusion was simple: metal sweats, therefore metal is unlivable. But condensation isn't a personality trait of steel, it's a situation. Warm indoor air carries water vapor. When that vapor reaches a surface that's below the dew point, it turns into liquid. In uninsulated sheds, the metal skin is the cold surface, so the moisture lands there and rains back down. People blame the metal, but the real problem is that warm, wet air is being allowed to touch a freezing sheet. This design blocks that contact. It insulates the arch on the inside with a continuous layer, then places a vapor barrier on the warm side, so household moisture can't migrate into the insulation and reach the cold skin. Every seam is sealed. Every penetration is treated like a leak. The goal is to create one continuous air barrier, because air movement is how both heat and moisture travel. Ventilation still matters, but it's controlled. Instead of letting the building breathe through random cracks, the structure vents on purpose. Humid air from cooking and washing is exhausted before it can build up. Fresh air is introduced without creating a drafty pressure pump. Dryness is not luck, it is managed. Now, add the shape. A curved roof does 2 winter jobs better than a framed peak. It sheds wind and sheds snow. Wind doesn't slam into a broad wall and create high pressure that forces air through gaps. It flows over the arch. Snow load slides and drifts rather than piling in heavy corners. That means fewer failures, fewer leaks, and fewer weak points where heat can be pulled away. The upper living space is not heated like a conventional room. it is supported from below. Warmth rises naturally from the basement reservoir, then spreads under the insulated arch. Because the ceiling is continuous, there are fewer cold bridges and fewer places for heat to short-circuit out. The space stays even instead of spiky. The builder also steals a little free energy, winter sun. With glazing placed to catch low-angle light, solar radiation warms the interior during the day. Warm air collects near the top of the arch, then circulates down as it cools, while cooler air can drift back toward the basement stairwell. The two levels create a gentle loop, mass below, air above, always moving slowly in the right direction. Put the pieces together, and the death trap becomes something else, a tight, insulated shell over a stable, charged basement. The critics weren't wrong about what happens when metal is used carelessly. They were wrong about what happens when it's used deliberately. That's why the design feels insulting to tradition. It suggests the valley's suffering was optional. It suggests that waking up to feed a stove isn't toughness, it's a leaky envelope. Then winter arrives to settle the argument for good. Deep negatives, hard wind, roads closed. In those conditions, the only question left is how long warmth lasts after the last log is added. The cold front doesn't announce itself with drama. It just refuses to leave. One night the thermometer drops, the next night it drops farther, and soon the valley is living inside a long, grinding minus. For days the sun looks weak and the wind feels personal. In ordinary houses, the routine becomes desperate math. How many logs until morning? How many hours until you must wake again? Across the county, people start shrinking their lives. Bedrooms are abandoned. Curtains are nailed shut. Families sleep in one room because it's the only space that can be kept above the mid-40s. Stoves are run hard enough to glow, and still the walls feel like they're stealing warmth. The basement becomes a freezer. Pipes threaten. Smoke sometimes backs up when draft gets sluggish in extreme cold. Everyone is tired, and tired people make mistakes. During that same stretch, the strange steel-over-stone house behaves differently. Not because it's magical, because it's buffered. While wind hammers other homes, the arch sheds it. While cold snaps yank heat out of thin walls, the basement mass releases warmth slowly, like a controlled leak in reverse. The house doesn't spike and crash, it coasts. That's when the first skeptic shows up, not to learn, but to confirm failure. He expects to find dripping panels and a roaring stove. Instead, the door opens and the air feels like late autumn. No damp smell, no icy ribs, no panic. The most shocking moment isn't comfort, it's timing. The heater was fired many hours earlier. In a conventional home, that gap would mean a cold house. Here, the stone is still warm to the touch, and the living space sits in the high 60s to low 70s. Outside, it's around 30 degrees Celsius, with wind that makes exposed skin sting in seconds. The skeptic asks the only question that matters. How much wood? The answer lands like an insult. Less than everyone else. Not half. A fraction. Because the system isn't trying to create heat constantly. It's trying to keep heat from escaping quickly. The masonry heater captures energy into mass instead of sending it straight up a flue. The basement stores it. The shell holds it. The wind can't reach the surfaces that matter. When the storm lasts multiple days, the comparison becomes undeniable. Neighbors who reload every few hours fight to hold the 40s and 50s. This house stays stable, sometimes skipping a full day between firings with only a gentle drop. That stability changes behavior. People sleep through the night. Meals happen at a table, not beside a stove like refugees. And then the number spreads. The inside-outside difference during the worst hours. A gap so large it forces the critics to stop talking and start measuring. That's how winter arguments end, not with speeches, but with thermometers. Soon, a second visitor arrives with a notebook and a thermometer used for weather stations. He checks corners, ceiling height, stairwell, basement wall surface. The readings are consistent. The warmest areas hover near the arch peak. The coolest sit near the far wall, still comfortable. He asks about fuel and is shown a stack and a simple tally. Dates, firings, and the amount of split wood used. It isn't a boast. It's a survival record. After the storm, the valley does what valleys always do. It copies results. Not everyone, and not immediately. Pride delays adoption. But the idea spreads through practical people first. They don't care what the structure looks like. They care about sleeping through the night. The first wave of copies focuses on appearance. A few people buy surplus arches and bolt them up fast, thinking the shape is the secret. That's when the old warnings seem to come true. Without airtight seams, warm, moist air reaches cold steel and condenses. Without the vapor barrier in the correct place, moisture migrates into insulation and finds the freezing skin. The result is damp panels, frost lines, and that familiar dripping misery. The critics point and say, "Told you." Others copy the basement without copying the logic. They build shallow stone walls in direct contact with frozen soil, or they pour thin slabs that conduct heat straight into the ground. They add heat, but it never stays. Their basements remain cold, and the living space above still swings wildly. They conclude the concept was a fluke. Then a smaller group copies the system, not the silhouette. They insulate the mass from the outside, so it stops bleeding to winter. They charge it from the inside with a heater designed for storage, not spikes. They seal the shell and vent on purpose. They treat moisture like a design constraint, not an accident. Those are the builds that succeed. The lesson is not, everyone should live under a steel arch. The lesson is that winter punishes leakage and rewards stability. Thermal mass works when it is protected from external swings and fed heat efficiently. Metal works when moisture is kept away from the cold skin and air movement is controlled. Earth sheltering works when you use the ground's steady temperature without inviting dampness. This is why the smartest solutions often look wrong. They remove drama. They trade visible struggle for invisible structure. They don't rely on heroics, only on physics. The valley's cultural shift is quiet, but real. In the beginning, avoiding winter sounded like cowardice. After the storm, it starts to sound like respect. People realize that endurance isn't the same as intelligence. Burning more wood isn't a badge, it's a cost. Waking up exhausted doesn't prove strength, it proves your system needs constant input. A good shelter gives you back time to rest, repair, think, and live. That is what the strange house truly demonstrated when the weather turns brutal. If you live in a cold place, the takeaway is practical. Ask 3 questions about any winter shelter. Where does wind hit it? Where can moisture travel? Where is heat stored? And how fast can it leak away? Answer those, and you'll understand why some homes stay calm while others panic. Drop a comment with your location and the coldest winter you've faced. Would you rather feed a fire all night or design a house that doesn't demand it? Note: this video uses narrative storytelling for education. Specific characters and events are fictionalized, but the principles discussed, thermal mass, insulation, vapor control, ventilation, and passive solar gain, are grounded in established physics and real-world building practice. This is not professional advice. Always follow current codes and safety guidance.